Hello, everybody. Again, I'm Sarah from the Lackawanna Historical Society, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly installment of Lackawanna Past Times. This week, we're excited to bring someone forward from time again. We're happy to introduce Louisa May Alcott. Miss Alcott is the daughter of transcendentalists. She was a nurse during the Civil War. She was a teacher, a suffragette, a feminist, and an abolitionist. Most of you may know her as the author of Little Women. Please, Miss Alcott, take it away.
I've been doing some writing and I have my books here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my life. Right. So bear with me, this newfangled Zoom, this technology that you have today in your time is a little new to me. So, but I'm going to start off with my life story. I was born in Germantown, Pennsylvania on November 29th, 1832. I know people always associate me with Boston, but my father was at a school teaching in Germantown, Pennsylvania on the day of my birth, and that my birthday and my father, Bronson Alcott, we share the same birthday. He was born on the same day. My father, Bronson Alcott, came from a poor Connecticut farm family, and my mother, Abba, was from a wealthy, influential Boston family. So by the time I was 10, we had lived in dozens of places in and around Boston. My father was a philosopher and a teacher, but since his methods were unusual, to say the least, he had a hard time keeping a school or indeed really working at all while I was growing up. A philosopher is a man in a balloon with his family and his friends holding the ropes, trying to haul him down. And my dear mother, Abby, she was the ballast to Father's balloon. She kept her feet on the ground, and she always found ways to keep us fed and clothed. She used to say, "Cast your bread upon the waters, and it will come back buttered." Because Father's head was always in the clouds. His best friend and truest supporter, Mr. Ralph Waldo Emerson, also helped us numerous times with gifts of money and other forms of support. I and my three sisters, Anne, Elizabeth, and May, grew up very poor in money on consequences of the fact that my father really didn't want to work, but we were rich in intellectual surroundings. In addition to Mr. Emerson as a friend and a teacher, we had Henry David Thoreau for our nature studies teacher and the notable author Nathaniel Hawthorne as a neighbor, along with many other acclaimed thinkers and educators. At one point in our wandering lives, we settled in Concord, and there my father was part of the grand transcendentalist movement in the early part of the century. And it was here that we would keep coming back to throughout our many moves. Every time we would move, it seems we would end up back in Concord. So my parents were staunch abolitionists, even going so far as to harbor an escaped fugitive whom we only knew as John. And he wasn't the only fugitive that we harbored during my childhood. I taught one man to write on the hearth with charcoal, his big fingers finding pen and pencil unmanageable. My father took me to a rally in Boston in 1850 when I was 18 on behalf of the trial of there was a fugitive slave, a Thomas Sims. He had run away from his master in the South, and he ended up in Boston. And we went to the trial, and when I watched it, I wrote later on in my diary, "I shall be horribly ashamed of my country if this thing happens and the slave is sent back." And he was unfortunately sent back to his state, despite the vigorous defense of one of my lawyer cousins, Samuel Sewall. So when war broke out on April 12, 1861, my family and I thought it was abolitionists' greatest day. Not only was it a righteous crusade against slavery, but it was so exciting to me. And I wrote in my diary that I've often longed to see a war, and now I have my wish. I wrote to a friend that Concord was a sight to behold. Everyone wears cockades wherever one can be stuck. Flags flap overhead like party-colored birds of prey. Mr. Emerson's son organized a company of cadets who poke each other's eyes out, bang their heads, and blow themselves up with gunpowder most valiantly. The Concord artillery mustered up in response to President Lincoln's call, and on April 19th, we had a little party and saw them off. My father, Mr. Emerson, and several other notable dignitaries spoke. A prayer was sent up, and off they went on the train. And it was a sad day seeing them off, for in a little town like this, we all seem like one family in times like these. So seeing all this action around me, it saddened me. I didn't like being left behind. My beloved sister Lizzie had died a few years before this, and I was sort of floundering in my life. I'd had some small success writing, and I wanted to continue doing that. I'd seen my book Flower Fables published in 1854. It was a little book of fairy stories, and I'd been making some other small pieces of writing pay, but now I started to study up on gunshot wounds, and I plotted to get appointed as a nurse. So I wrote in my diary, I long to be a man, but as I can't fight, I will content myself with working for those who can. I took part in a 2-day marathon at Town Hall, sewing violently on patriotic blue shirts, sort of like today when you're making masks. I wanted to do something to contribute. During the first half of the war, though, all I did really was stay home, and I wrote, read, sewed, and wanted something to do. I took a teaching position because the publisher of the Atlantic magazine rejected one of my stories, and he told me I was no good at writing and I should stick to teaching. So I set up a little school, but I really hated it. I spent the winter teaching, and I made barely any money. So I sold a story of mine to the Concord Monitor, and I made $30, more than I'd made in 4 months of teaching. I was infuriated that someone said I couldn't write. I said, I won't teach. I can write, and I will prove it. So after that, I wrote several lurid tales, my blood and thunder tales, I always refer to them as, for Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. They bought that stuff up, and they would buy as many as I could come up with. So I think my natural ambition is for the lurid style. I indulge in gorgeous fancies and wish that I dare inscribe them on my pages and set them before the public. I think I wrote those sorts of stories because I was really anxious for an adventure of my own. By early 1862, I was almost 30, and I was still restless, and I wanted an adventure of my own before it was too late. So I decided to go to Washington as a nurse, if I could find a place. In November in my journal, I wrote that I love nursing and I must let out my pent-up energy in some new way. So Dorothea Dix, the superintendent of the Union Army Nursing Corps, had stipulated that volunteers for nursing be plain looking. That I could do. And 30 was the minimum age, and you had to be married. She didn't want people going out, I think, looking for a husband. I didn't meet those last 2 criteria when I signed up, but Miss Dix had been one of my father's teaching assistants at his Temple School in Boston. So I had a little pull there, and I got into their nursing program. So while I waited to be called, I got my things together. Nurses don't need nice things, thank heaven, because I didn't have them. I also sent away another thrilling story, Pauline's Passion and Punishment, to a contest in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. I hoped to win the $100 prize. When I came back from my nursing adventures, I found out that I had. I got my marching orders on December 11th, and I had to leave for Washington the next morning to report to the Union Hotel Hospital in Georgetown. My family packed me up with all sorts of good things and sent me off on the train. So I went to the Union Hotel Hospital, formerly the Union Hotel. Now it was a hospital. When I finally got to Washington City, I found the hospital to be an imposing building with guards at the door and a very trying quantity of men lounging about. My heart beat faster than usual, and it struck me that I was very far from home. Yeah, I was thinking about what had I gotten myself into. The Union Hotel had been hastily converted into a hospital. It was badly lit, crowded, and poorly ventilated. The windows were nailed shut, and whatever panes were smashed had been draped with curtains to keep out the cold. The room I was in was labeled the ballroom, which wasn't inappropriate, if gunshot wounds could christen it, you know, ball and shot. So they put me in charge of a ward of 40 soldiers. My first big test came a few days after the bloody Battle of Fredericksburg. Wounded men started pouring into the hospital in droves. Having a taste for ghastliness, I had rather longed for the wounded to come. I thought this was going to be a great adventure. But when I peeped into the dusty street lined with what I had innocently called market carts, now unloading their sad freight at our door, my ardor experienced a sudden chill, and I indulged in a most unpatriotic wish that I was safe back home. These men all came in and had to be tended to, and I was so afraid on seeing so many men, ragged, gaunt, and pale, mud to the knees, bloody bandages, untouched since being put on the night before. It was terrible. The matron gave me a wash basin, a sponge, and a block of brown soap and requested that I begin washing them. If she had requested me to shave them all or dance a hornpipe on the stove funnel, I should have been less staggered. But to scrub some dozen wards of creation at a moment's notice was really staggering. You have to understand, I had nothing but sisters and a womanly man for a father. And in this day and age, the thought of undressing a man who is not related to me and washing him is really rather staggering. But I got through it, and much more than that as the days went on. The next day, I assisted in amputations. I learned how to dress wounds from a surgeon who seemed to regard a dilapidated body very much as I would have regarded a damaged garment. In moments of calm, I did what I really enjoyed doing. I helped the men write letters home. And I wrote to a friend at the beginning of January, I never began the year in a stranger place than this, 500 miles from home, among strangers, doing painful duties all day long and leading a life of constant excitement in this great house, surrounded by 300 or 400 men in all stages of suffering, disease, and death. Though often homesick, heartsick, and worn out, I like it. But 6 weeks into my assignment, I developed typhoid pneumonia. This same disease would kill our wonderful matron, Hannah Ropes, several weeks after I was stricken. But before she collapsed and died, she sent an urgent telegram to my father requesting that I be taken home immediately. Because at first I didn't want to go. When I first got sick, I wanted to stay. This was my job. This was what I'd signed on for. But after she died, it scared me. And I thought to myself, I could die here. So when my father came to take me home, I went. And that was in mid-January. It took me until March to start on the road to recovery. Once I regained my health, I was approached by the editors of a weekly anti-slavery paper to make a series from my letters home during my time at the hospital. Thus, I came to write hospital sketches. You can see that right here. It was the first book where I really found my voice. And if you like Little Women, I always tell people that I meet, if you like Little Women, which I have over here, you like Jo March, you like that voice, you want to read hospital sketches, because really it's Jo March goes to war. After that, I kept writing blood and thunder stories under assumed names to help my family, because really, part of the reason why I was writing those stories was they paid well, and my family always seemed to need money. And then in 1867, my editor asked me if I would write a girl's book. It took me a while to decide on the plan because I told him I'd try. I didn't really know any other girls besides my own sisters. So I decided I would model it on my own family, my sisters and our childhood adventures, but set it during our lately finished war. And so, of course, we have Little Women. And it took me some time to write it. It was published in September of 1868, and I took my editor's advice and I retained the copyright. It was a new and unusual arrangement, which other authors were not doing, but it turned out to be the best business decision I ever made. I know people think ladies shouldn't know about or be in business, but I heartily believe in a woman's right to any branch of labor for which they prove their fitness. Work is such a beautiful and helpful thing, and independence is so delightful that I wonder there are any lazy people in the world. Throughout my life, work freely chosen and pursued was the one constant. When I decided to write the second half of Little Women, I picked up the story 3 years after the ending of the first. Readers kept writing to me, begging to know who the Little Women married, as if that was the only end and aim of a woman's life. So I told someone I won't marry Jo to Laurie to please anyone. So I made a funny match for her, and the second book was also a success. From there, my fame as a writer only grew, and I became a beloved author of realistic children's tales. Overall, I wrote 200 short stories and 41 novels. By the time I took my second European tour in the early 1870s, I had become a very wealthy woman. I had a second hit with Little Men, which I think is over here, yep, right here. And that was published in 1870. By then I was making over $7,000 a year, which I believe translates into over $2 million in your money today. So I was always worried about our finances because we were so poor growing up. So I was always putting money aside for what I called the Alcott Sinking Fund. And I now began to realize how rich I was and that I could indulge in my love of fine clothes and keep my beloved mother warm and cozy as I had vowed to do as a teenager. But while my fame was building, my little pathetic family, as I called them, was slowly falling apart. My dear sister Anna's husband passed away suddenly in 1870, just as I was getting back from Europe. In addition to leaving Nan behind, he also left 2 fine sons, Fred and John. My dear mother, Marmee, passed away in 1877 after some years of failing health. And she was our rock, and she really was the practical woman of the one of the family. And I wrote that to someone, that father goes about being restless with his anchor gone. I also found myself at loose ends without her, and I wrote in my diary, a great warmth has gone out of life, and there is no motive to go on. During this time, my other sister May was in Europe, learning to be a great artist, which was her dream. At this point, we had moved from the house we had lived in so many years, Orchard House, or as I like to call it, Apple Slum, into Thoreau's former home. And there we lived, my sister Nan, Freddie, John, myself, and father. And during all this time, I was constantly writing children's stories to keep everybody in money, to make sure that we could all live together and be safe. I also decided to take up my mother's cause of women's suffrage in earnest. My mother in the 1830s had been among one of the first activists to call for extending the vote to women. But like a lot of women in the 1830s, she decided to work on abolition first, thinking if we could get colored people, colored men could get the vote, then women would get it afterwards. So I followed along with the Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association. In our area of New England, the strategy was to start by getting approval to vote in local town meetings. We asked to be allowed to vote on the issues of children and education, because men are always telling us that our sphere is the home and children. So what could be more important? Our state was considered passing the measure in 1877. We were going to get a measure where we could vote for school boards. And my mother was thrilled. Seeing her goal in sight, she would tell everyone who would listen, I need to vote before I die, even if my daughters have to carry me. We would have done it. We would absolutely have borne her up and taken her to the voting place, but she passed away right before this happened. So in 1878, I organized reading groups to raise consciousness about the importance of voting, and I circulated petitions to encourage registration. because our local school board decided by then that they were going to let women vote in deciding who would be on the school board. But none of my work helped. The ladies of Concord showed little interest in voting. I couldn't believe it. I gave them a good scolding and offered to drive the timid sheep to the fatal spot where they seemed to expect some awful doom. But I was the first woman to register my name as a voter in the state of Massachusetts. Out of 100 eligible women in town, only 7 did the same thing as me. A very poor record for a town which ought to lead if it really possesses all the intelligence claimed for it. So I was the first to break the ice and actually vote. In February of 1878, my little sister May was married to a Swiss banker in France, and my father turned 79. And that summer, my father had his long-held dream of a school of philosophy back at Orchard House. We had 30 students. Father was the dean, and he's in his glory with plenty of talk to swim in. People will laugh, but will enjoy some new thing in this dull town. And happy as I was to see the local snobs get their comeuppance, I had little patience for the swarms of budding philosophers. My feeling is if they were philanthropists, and that I should enjoy it, but speculation is a waste of time when there is so much real work crying to be done. Why discuss the unknowable till our poor are fed and the wicked saved? So by November of 1879, my little sister May had a baby girl that she named Louisa. I finally had my niece Lulu. I wanted to visit May before and after the baby came, but I didn't think my health would permit me going over to Europe again. And I used to tell people that before the war, I was never ill, but after the war, I was never well. And shortly after that, my poor little sister May died from childbirth in France. And I found out from Mr. Emerson. I came home one day, and there he was. He was looking up at May's portrait in the house, tearful with the paper in his hand. And May's last wishes, she anticipated she might not survive childbirth, and a lot of women didn't in that day. But her last wishes were that her daughter be turned over to me to raise. So I wrote in my diary, I see now why I lived, to care for May's child and not leave Annie, my sister, all alone. So I was going to be a mother at 47. I waited for months for the baby to arrive on a steamship. While I waited, I wrote even more children's stories to bring in more money and keep the family comfortable. I didn't want May's baby to lack for anything, and she didn't while she was with me. And I had editors writing to me around this time, looking for some more new stories once the baby came, but I responded that I was busy with baby. I could afford to take time off from writing. In 1881 alone, Roberts Brothers printed almost 35,000 copies of my earlier titles, and in January of that year, they paid me $4,000. I was a very rich woman. I think I was the highest paid female author in America. After 1882, I continued to write little tales for Lulu, and I worked on furthering the goals of women's suffrage and also the cause of temperance. Despite the fact that I enjoy a drink now and then, I was really concerned about daredevil drinking among my teenage male readers, and I allude to it in some of my stories. I think Rose in Bloom, I have the one young man, bad things happen to him because he tends to drink too much. I was worried about it, so I helped organize Concord's first temperance society. And I spent the first half of the 1880s basically taking care of other people. And I felt that I really would never get to live my own life. I always seemed to be helping other people. Father had his school of philosophy, and we had 400 callers at Orchard House. My sister Anna said it was like running a house. I said it was more like running a hotel. And it was all kind of boring for us, but it made Father happy. By 1882, I wrote the final book that closed up the March family story, Joe's Boys. I think I have that right here. There it is. And it took me a while to write that, whereas the other first book, Little Women, had come so quickly to me. My health was kind of going downhill. And I found some time by 1885 to get away a bit and live by myself in Boston. And I tried to have some fun, because I always loved going to theater and things like that, music, but my health was not good. When I had the youth, I had no money. Now I have the money, I have no time. And when I get the time, if I ever do, I shall have no health to enjoy life, was really how I put it. But I continued to write for the children's market. By 1887, I was pretty sick and I was really no longer writing. Whenever I felt better, I would take little Lulu out or attend the theater or a lecture, because I had a lifelong love of the theater. By July of 1887, I felt really that I would not get better, and I made my nephew John my legal heir to bequeath my copyrights to. And that fall, I wrote some more short stories. By March of 1888, my father was doing very poorly. He had had a stroke. He had done so well, but then in 1888, in the early part of the year, he had a stroke and he lost his power of speech. And I had a final visit with him on the 1st of March. And I gave him some flowers, and he kissed me and urged me to come with him. I think he knew that he was dying. We said goodbye, and I knew it was our last, and he died on the 4th of March. And after that, I didn't feel well at all. I went to bed, and my sister Anna came and stayed with me. And I passed away on the morning of March 6th, 1888, just 2 days after Father. It seems we were destined to celebrate our birthdays and our ending days together. And to him, he had written a poem shortly after I came back from the war, and he called me Duty's faithful child, because of he saw that I was willing to sacrifice my life for our country. And an author afterwards, after I had passed away, the first biographer of me saw me as the children's friend. So in my short lifetime, I wrote 252 short stories and 41 novels. So I feel like I accomplished something there, all while loving my family. So.
All right, well, I guess that's all we have for today. Miss Alcott, again, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. Please tune in again next week. Watch your email and also your Facebook page. Next week, our presenter will be our friend.
And then afterwards, we'll have, I guess, a question and answer session. Sarah, is that how that works?
Yes. Again, watch out for the snow that's apparently coming, and keep washing your hands.